childhood up, we have had to conform to a certain social game. And so we're in a constant state of competition. Criticism, stigma. You can't make a mistake.
Welcome, everybody, to Friends of Failure. I'm your host, Sam, and this is my co-host, Megan.
Yeah.
Really excited to introduce you to our guest today, Jay Shifman. How you doing?
Good. Happy to be here. Happy to be chatting with y'all on a nice Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I always enjoy Sunday. I don't know if I could necessarily say it's a day of rest for me. I get a lot of stuff done on Sunday, but it's very casual and not stressful, so it feels like a rest day, right? Weather, I would say the weather's nice, except it is a little toasty for us. I pretty sure it's a little warm there for you too, if you're outside, right?
It's 90 outside, but I'm in a nice AC office right now.
Loving it. Gotta stay brisk during the summertime, you know.
That's right.
Jay, I would love for you to for anybody listening, to kind of give us like your intro, tell us about kind of what you do and who you are.
Well, I am the founder of Choose Your Struggle. It's a company that aims to end stigma and promote honest and fact-based education around mental health, substance misuse and recovery, and drug use and policy. I'm a guy in long-term recovery myself, and I'm the host of a couple of shows. The Choose Your Struggle podcast is my weekly, and the one that I think a lot of people know me for right now is a documentary podcast that dropped in April called Choose Your Struggle Presents Made It Season 1 Stay Savage, in which I told the story of a woman by the name of Sarah Laurel here in South Philly, who started the harm reduction and recovery housing nonprofit Savage Sisters after being thrown out of the second story window of a trap house. She's a person I'm delighted to call a friend. I'm on the board of the organization, and it was a labor of love, but the podcast is really helping change people's ideas about what addiction looks like, and what about people who use drugs and people who struggle with drug substance misuse and addiction. So definitely would recommend people check that out and let me know what you think. But you can find my writing all over. You can find me on all your favorite podcasts like this one.
That was awesome. It's definitely one of those things where it's a task a lot of people probably couldn't do, right? Like you have to have a desire to participate in something like that, right? And it's for the greater good.
Yeah, definitely.
And being able to serve people, especially in a realm of having conversations about the stigma of, let's say, addiction. And I mean, having a story of being thrown out of a second story, right? Like, that's hard to talk about for some people, right? It's uncomfortable, but I think the uncomfortable things are what allow us to grow, right? Like, that's the whole thing about us, is failure is uncomfortable, but it's very necessary if we want to move forward to, I think, better things, better versions of things. Being in the military, obviously, whenever we leave high school and stuff, right? People go to college, they go to the military, they whatever, and a lot of people drink, and a lot of people don't look at that as like an addiction, right? Or whatever it is. And so I'm curious as to, whenever you talk to people about this, do you have a way to start the conversation that leads into it becoming heavier as you go, where it's like kind of lighthearted at the beginning and then it turns into like, hey, let's really talk about the actual issue? Or are you like hey, let's rip that Band-Aid off and deep dive?
Well, I think that there's two answers to that. On my show, the way that we do it is on Choose Your Struggle, the weekly, we start with the person's story because that helps them feel more comfortable to open up. And it also helps the listeners. Like, it's one thing to take what this person says, but it's another thing if you know that, oh, they've lived this, like this is their experience. And so we always start with their story first and then go into some of the ideas or their work if they work in policy or whatever the case is. So that's what's made that show so successful. In terms of the day-to-day life, No, man, I rip it right off. And you know, it's one of those things that people either go with you or they retreat, and you kind of have that mindset of like they weren't going to come on this journey anyways, right? Um, and it's funny, a couple of summers ago, my wife and I were in the car and we were listening to this report on NPR of a woman whose mission was to eliminate small talk. And so it was amazing. I love this, and I've adopted this for myself.
Yeah.
What she does is she would walk up to someone, whether she was in line for tickets in a movie theater, whatever, and before they could get out the whole how's the drive over here, how's the weather, she'll launch into some deep and personal question. And the reason she does that is what I just said, is that either people go, wow, you want to know that, and she's like, yeah, and then they have a really wonderful, connection conversation, or people immediately shut down and she's like, that's fine, they weren't going to go with me anyways, and I don't want to engage in small talk. And here's what's funny is that the interviewer said, okay, we have to know what question has the highest success rate. And she said, funny enough, it's how'd you lose your virginity? Because people either just go, nope, and shut down completely, or they're like, oh my God, like that's the thing you actually want to know. And you can learn so much more about the sort of minor details in the story of that story about a person. What their high school experience was like if they lost virginity in high school or college or whatever, who they were at that time. There's so much more that you can get from that story. So that's sort of how I engage on a day-to-day level, because these are topics that the topics that I work on, the topics that I care about, are ones that people will not open up about. And so I jump right into that deep end, and the people that want to come swimming with me come swimming with me.
I 100% believe in that right out the gate, just because if you asked me that question and I shut down, it's because I got defensive of like, who is this person? And, I'm not sure how I feel about it. Right. But as a person who's recently really focused on trying to find a consistent level of authenticity all the time, because I realized that, being in different fields of customer service while growing up and through my 20s and stuff, I had to put on a face, or I always felt like I had to put on a face, right? And the thing is being authentic, you don't have to be, mean, right? Or, even if there's a confrontational question or situation, that doesn't mean that it's bad, right?
Well,
and I think a lot of us get really uncomfortable.
And you still choose what you share. Like, you don't have to overshare, or you're not pressured to it, hopefully, at least. And we a lot on this podcast talk about how you can't force someone into change. You can't drag a horse to water. And I'm sure in your line of work, it's the same thing. You can't force people to see what you're trying to say, or even someone who's deep in that situation itself. You can't make them change. They have to choose it.
Yeah, I think that there's sort of two levels of that, right? Because you cannot force someone to believe what you believe.
Yeah.
What you can force someone to do is take a hard look at their own beliefs. So, for me at least, when my number one focus is changing the way people look at drug use and drug users. Because I've done a TED talk about this, and the whole point, I write about this for various publications, and the whole point I always try to make is, if you want to understand why people look at people like me who use drugs and struggle with drugs in a negative way, and why we don't get the help that we deserve, it's because that we have been taught for literally over 100 years that drug users are bad. And you go back to the very first drug laws in this country, which were all aimed at certain subclasses of people in this country. The very first law around drugs in the United States was in the late 1870s, and it directly was aimed at Asian immigrants. And you go from there to the early 1900s, when it was black men, and specifically black men, and Mexican immigrants. And you just keep going, and almost luckily we are blessed with the fact that our forefathers were so overtly racist, because you can't argue, their words are right there. They are openly talking about the need for these laws because black men are using heroin to sleep with white women. It's out there. And so if you're able to say to someone, look, I know you think this about this substance or about someone like me, let me show you where this comes from, you start to help someone understand that, all right, I may not agree with you, but at least I know that what I think is built on a giant pile of BS. And the more you do that, the more you can show that there's no substance there. And if we can get rid of that sort of false foundation and fill it back in with common sense and fact-based education, that's how we start to change the way people think about people like myself and the people that I care about. So, no, you can't change the way someone thinks, but you can show them the fallacies in what they think and say, look, please consider looking at this giant pile of evidence that says that you're wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I don't do that with talking about like substance abuse or, I don't know a lot about like where the law started and whatnot, but I think a lot of us too, as things are progressing forward, I think more people are at least asking the right questions, right? And then it's all about finding the people like yourself or in other circumstances, just the reality that the truth that we think we know might not be the truth at all, right? Like you said, the fallacies of it. And so just offering the viewpoint of like, hey, this is what the truth is. What do you think it is that you believe in, right? Sometimes people aren't ready for it, right? Like, the paradigm shift, I guess, like you try to wake people up and go like, hey, look around and see what's happening. And I had a time where I was really happy in my little bubble. Like I was just having the time of my life, or at least I thought I was. And then I started to open my eyes and I was like, I'm kind of miserable. And it was like, why am I so miserable? And then, thankfully, maybe at one point I felt like I was a little late to the game, but I started to try to like, wake up, as some of them would say, right? Like try to see things for what it actually is. And, it's honorable work to be willing to just do that all the time, right? You, if I understand correctly, you have a background that really helps you in doing this, right? Like in terms of not only the work experience that you have, but like your education as well, right?
Yeah, so I like to say that I am one of the few people, unfortunately, who mixes both lived and learned experiences on this topic of drug use and substance misuse. As a guy in recovery, I did get my degree in psychology in 2012, and have spent the last decade since getting certificates in everything from understanding the history of addiction in this country and internationally to the actual psychology behind drug use and that kind of thing. I am by far not the most educated person, and I look up to a lot of people with that education that I admire, but also I don't know many people with more education than me that also have lived experience, and that's a good thing. They shouldn't want that lived experience. I didn't want that lived experience either, but it is dependent on people like me who've been there and are in the rooms with the educated people to say, look, I have not studied this for 30 years like you did, but you never woke up on your bathroom floor, going through withdrawal. And because of that, we both need a seat at this table. So, I like to bring both of those hats to the table when I'm doing this work, as the person who understands what is being taught, but at the same time can say, that's not quite in keeping with my own experience on this subject.
And I think experience, you're right. It's a thing that you can't replace with any amount of education. And you're kind of serving as that conduit in between for the people that are going through it currently, and then kind of the education side of it. What are the gaps or the failures that you see on people that are purely, book educated on this issue? Where do they not, seem to understand?
Maybe the disconnect. Yeah,
that's a really great question. So there's sort of two different directions with that. The first is that there's a lot of, in both camps, by the way, there's a lot of bias. I work with a lot of people with lived experience who just despise the people with the PhDs. And most of that is because, to paint with a very broad brush, although all of us who do this work have at least one story of a PhD telling us to get out of their sandbox. It's not really their fault. I mean, this country really highlights people with lived or learned experience over lived experience, and there's a lot of that sort of digested by those who have been in academia for a long time. So there is a little bit of that hate on both sides, which can get a little tiresome. But in terms of the people with the learned experience only, there is a lot of sort of reliance on theory, and that's beautiful. Like, yes, people have been studying this for a long time, but until you know what it's like to be out there, I mean, uh, I haven't been in a dangerous situation over my drug use in over 10 years, and so people who are going through that right now with the surge of tranquilizer dope, and now we're seeing benzo dope. I mean, the fact is, if you're buying heroin off the street, you're not buying heroin. It's just not in there anymore. So for people to be sitting up in a university somewhere talking about what that must be like is throw that out the window. It's garbage. We have so many people who are living this every day who can tell us, and that's why the organizations that I admire are the ones who are on the street level working with the people who are struggling in this moment. So yeah, I mean, I serve as a bit of a bridge between the two camps, but I wouldn't be anything if I was trying to talk about what it was like for people out on the street today, because I have no idea.
That's a great awareness to have. I mean, I obviously I think the only way I could really kind of relate would be like, I got out of the Marine Corps in 2014, and if I tried to tell you what it would be like today, I have no idea. I have been out of that for so long, like I don't get it anymore. And sure, it's the whole once a Marine, always a Marine, like there's that camaraderie, but it's like I don't know what the experience is like today. I can't even imagine going through 2020 or 2021 being in the military, right? Like I was fortunate enough, my job wasn't that serious. And so I think that's pretty cool. I do wonder, in terms of education, it's very important to go through the avenues, right? Like going to university, right? And like studying and acquiring certifications and stuff. But have you ever had moments where even when you're learning from some of, let's say, the greats or like the people that you admire, where you have a disconnect with some of the stuff that they're like teaching, where you're like, well, is this, I don't want to say archaic. Is this maybe not up to par, right, with what's currently happening, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, yeah.
We're learning on such a rapid rate now these days.
Yeah, and that's thank you for saying that, Sam, because I do want to make this caveat clear, is especially when it comes to drug use and drug policy, this is changing so rapidly that even if you got out of school a year ago, you're already way behind. So I think it's really important that we all be okay with saying, I don't know, or I may be wrong, right? But there's sort of two examples of that I can think of, one of which is really funny to me. So I did go back to get my degree, or started to a couple of years ago. There's only 2 programs in the entire United States focused on drug policy, not drug counseling. And I didn't want to do drug counseling, so I took one of these policy degrees. It was a master's degree out of South Dakota State University online. In the very first class, they told us what textbook to get. It was from 2006. And as I just said, I mean, a year ago, it's already old. This was archaic. And the first chapter was on the dangers of weed. And I reached out to my professor and I was like, hold up. Like, I live in a state where I have my card. What are you teaching? And she was like, well, we still need to know about the dangers, and it might be legal where you are, but all this stuff. So I was like aghast. I was like, all right, it's one thing to be like there are 2 sides to a debate. It's another thing to try to pretend this isn't real. So I actually reached out to the Board of Regents at this school. And because this is a state school, they referred me to the governor's office, who, and this is South Dakota, right? This is not a bastion of liberalization here. And they looked into the program and then shut it down. They were like, this is so bad what they're doing that we're going to pull their accreditation. So that was a whole thing. I got my money back. I got a thank you from the governor of South Dakota. It was a whole thing. And so that was kind of comical. But there are people that I admire who have done incredible work. But if you are of an older generation, let's say, you probably still think some things that are a little bit harmful. And the one that you see the most is what we like to call cannabis exceptionalism. Now, I'm a giant cannabis fan. I have my medical card. I do think that we're finally in this age where we are at least being able to study. Until a couple of years ago, there was only one place in the entire country that was allowed to do research on cannabis, and it was the government's one farm, right? And so then you have this round robin of, well, we're not going to legalize it because we don't know anything about it, and we're not going to do any research because it's not legal. And so you're starting to see that change, and I think that's beautiful. But there is this older sect who are saying we can only focus on cannabis, nothing else. We shouldn't legalize anything else. Nothing else should be decriminalized. And that's really dangerous thinking, because there is no difference at all between what we should be doing with cannabis and a lot of these other substances. I mean, yes, cannabis is safer than even alcohol, right? But at the end of the day, the US's policies have never been about safety. And if you want proof of that, the two most dangerous substances in this country are alcohol and nicotine, and yet both are legal, right? Nicotine helps lead to so many people dying that when I did my TED Talk last year, I did a graph on all the lives not only lost but negatively impacted by substances, just to show that this has nothing to do with safety. And nicotine was so far above everything else that I actually did two graphs, because if you just put nicotine, everything else was squished at the bottom. I was like, this doesn't do me any good. So I did the nicotine graph, and then I did everything else. But here's the thing about nicotine too, is that nicotine actually is a perfectly safe chemical. It's just everything else is mixed in with cigarettes, all the rat poison and all that kind of shit. So the fact is that none of this has anything to do with safety. And if you actually back off of that incorrect assertion, you can go, all right, what are we actually talking about here? And that gets back to my earlier point of all of it being based on a lot of BS that almost entirely comes from racism and classism. So if we can start looking at those things, and that's why I admire people who are of the older generation are willing to go, maybe we didn't get this thing right. Maybe we should be taking another look at this. And the one name I have to shout out, because I shout him out every time I do this, is the head of, I believe he's the head of psychology at Columbia University. His name is Dr. Carl Hart, one of the great thinkers right now about drug use. He recently wrote a best-selling book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups that basically tries to pull back the curtain and show the U.S. is not only not leading the world, we are almost dead last. All these other countries have kind of left us in the dust, and there's a reason that while other countries are getting better at eliminating overdoses, the U.S. is lapping the rest of the world, and it's because of these harmful policies.
I'm going to do my best, and either one of you, please, feel free to stop me if I get too all over the place. But I was literally going to bring up the whole alcohol and cigarettes, but like nicotine in general, like vaping is the thing that's like hurting a lot of people too, because I could tell you a list of things that are in cigarettes, because like I remember being a kid in the DARE program and whatever, which is funny.
I was gonna bring up the DARE program.
well what's so funny about that is like I went from knowing nothing about drugs to being like, well, if I do this, I could meet a drug dealer, and if I meet a drug dealer, I could get drugs. Like I was like in 5th grade, like it was crazy. But so like even nicotine or caffeine, right? I'm a person that I'm a certified personal trainer. I don't do it anymore. But I learned a lot about nutrition and all that jazz. And like sugar, in my opinion, is just as dangerous as, nicotine. Like if you don't know what you're doing, right, or how it's getting consumed, there's all these other additives. And like, that's where the first thing, the eye-opening of like, hey, it's not about safety, it's about maybe control. And so one thing that's crazy to me is, you made that phone call, you end up talking to a governor, they're like, they take a look at it and they go, oh, what is this? This is like probably bad, not good. But one thing that I feel a lot of us see, and we've all been seeing it forever, is how much of, well, I can't talk about that because, I'm in politics and like I have an image, or I'm a celebrity and I have an image, or, I'm whatever, I have an image. And so it's like, I don't want to talk about it. And, it really bothers me because I feel like we've created all these weird things that hinder progress, because.
And it kind of hides what's actually happening if no one talks about it on a public platform.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I think part of the problem too is, you know, some of the things that you bring up. I mean, you obviously know what you're talking about. You've been in this for a long time. Not only do you have life experience, but you're educated in it, right? And you're staying on top of it. You have a lot of things that you can bring to the table that are very important to discuss. Even though I'm not in the world of it, like I see what you're talking about and I agree with you. And somebody's got to do it. Do you people that have nothing to do with it, right? They've never had addiction, which that's BS. We both know that we're all addicted to something, right? But like they've never had any major issues with addiction or alcoholism or understanding what's going on, you know, in America or even globally in terms of drug use and understanding it. Do you have people who try to argue where they're like, well, hey man, hold up. Like, I know that we've talked about, there are issues with like the older way of thinking and, you know, the DARE program. I don't even know if that exists. But do you have that issue with younger people as well? Like, I'm not trying to attack anybody based on their age. I'm just saying, like, I'm in my 30s and I noticed that like I'm in this weird place where, you know, I'll talk to people that are, let's say, early 20s. And like, I kind of feel like the disconnect of like, man, I really don't understand what it's like for you being that age going through this world. And then I talk to people that are in their 50s and I'm like, I don't really understand the version of the world you had. I mean, I got to experience a little bit of time before the internet, but like not enough for it to really shape me, you know?
So I think that it is changing pretty rapidly. So you mentioned the politics thing, and I use this quote every time, and because we're sitting here and I can actually pull it up on my computer, I didn't want to bastardize it. So until when Nixon launches the war on drugs in 1972, at that time, drugs were not a big problem in the United States. In fact, in most places, a lot of these things were still used in medicine almost, I mean, through the 50s, right? So it wasn't that long ago. You know, you're talking about, we remember the time before the internet. That's farther away than between the time of all these drugs still being in medicine and Nixon still launching the war on drugs. We would have had, if we were alive at that time, parents still using, you know, heroin in their medicine at home. Cocaine had been in Coke 30 years before. I mean,
right.
This was not that far off, right? So Nixon, sort of out of nowhere, launches this war on drugs. And there's a quote from his number one advisor, who was the assistant to the president, John Ehrlichman. And Ehrlichman is very famous for people who study history because Ehrlichman goes down in Watergate. He's one of the big guys who goes down during Watergate. Here's his quote. So he says, "Did we know we couldn't make it illegal to be either black or against the war? Of course we did. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." That was John Ehrlichman on his deathbed to an amazing reporter by the name of Dan Baum, who got him to admit this not long before he died. Now, that's 1972. So Nixon very famously is known for what he called the Southern strategy, which is his way of being overtly racist without being overtly racist. So this was a piece of that, of Nixon going after his enemies in the name of something that people would support. But to be honest, the drug war isn't really that big of a deal throughout Nixon, and of course, then he goes away, Ford, Carter, whatever, right? The guy who takes this and pours gasoline on it was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan saw this, and look, I despise the man, but he was a brilliant political mind, and he saw this and said, I'm going to run on this. It's not a coincidence that his wife becomes known as the Just Say No woman. I mean, this was all very calculated. So Reagan does a study when he comes into office, and he finds that only 2% of people in this country think that drugs are the biggest issue. By 2 years later, or 3 years later, I don't remember the actual date, it is over 60%. They've hit this thing all the time trying to make this into a giant issue, and they succeeded. And coincidentally, it's also when AIDS is going on, and then we have what we now know as the moral panic that was the crack epidemic, and all of a sudden drugs are every night in our nightly news. So guys, again, like Carl Hart, Maya Salovitz have done amazing journalism to show there never was a crack epidemic. There were a lot of people using crack, but the number of people who were actually struggling with a negative side of crack use is minute, considering what we now call the opioid epidemic, kind of have all this happening over again. So this was a giant moral panic that was used by the Reagan White House to further their own goals. And he knew it would work because it always works, because they saw what Nixon did with this issue and they said, thank you, we're going to take that football and run with it. Now, all of that sounds conspiratorial, and I get that. I mean, this is all like, until 20 years ago, if you told people that the CIA did experiments on people using LSD, you were a crackpot, right? And then MK Ultra gets leaked, and now we all know that was real. This sounds very similar, and thanks to, again, Dan Baum and Maya Salovitz and some of these amazing journalists who have been working tirelessly. Johan Hari is another one. If you don't know, Johan Hari wrote Chasing the Scream, which was the most illuminating book on the war on drugs, and it not only was it really good, and I think it's one of the best, it actually was a bestseller. It was on the top of the bestseller list for a while, the New York Times bestseller list. So I say all that to say 10 years ago, talking the way that I talk now was like, go to the corner, you little crazy hat person. And now these are literally top of the New York Times best-selling list authors who are exposing this just awful things that our government did in the name of drug use and drug abuse and all of this, right? So to answer your question is, no, we're not seeing that so much from the younger generation, because just the way we kind of remember before the internet, sure, some of them remember a little before the times that we were starting to wake up about drug use and drug users, but for most of them, those lies of the past, Dare, Just Say No, that's like they never were alive during that BS. So they were not indoctrinated the way that we were, and that's why their generation. Look, I had somebody reach out the other day, an old friend I hadn't talked to in years, who said, my daughter's going to college, and she reached out to me and didn't ask for condoms the way we all did when we went to college. She asked where she could get some Narcan. And I was like, I don't know how to get Narcan, but I know Jay does. So she reached out to me to say, where can I get my daughter the opioid overdose reversing drug, right? This is what we're seeing for the next generation, and it's because they didn't have all of those lies shoved down their throat like we did when we were kids.
I have a couple of questions. So I really appreciate, like, you already have like a very good understanding, not only of like the history and how we got here, right? Which is very, very important. But I feel like you have a unique perspective from the journey that you're going through. And so two things that I'm curious about. The first one would be, I guess the part A of the question would be, do you think anything in the mainstream media is actually truth? I mean, sure, there could be parts of it, but do you think that it's more of a lot of the media that we're getting exposed to, especially like, let's say TV, like cable? Would you agree that it's more fabricated than it has truth to it? On this topic? We'll say this topic, sure.
Yeah, so unfortunately, in better, there is a really beautiful and vibrant harm reduction community online, obviously in person too. Here in Philly, it's robust, but especially on Twitter, and you can find some really incredible thinkers. It would take me too long to list everybody that I follow, but there are some people who focus on that question exclusively, which is trying to help people understand why journalists are getting this topic so wrong. And it's mostly because journalists for a long time have taken the law enforcement words to be verbatim. Like, that's the answer here. What is really dangerous about that, I mean, there's obviously a lot of problems with it, but on this topic alone, is that if you just think about that for a second, law enforcement have a very specific job. They're not scientists, right? And so when it comes to, if you want to know about locking up statistics, sure, ask law enforcement. What is happening in our jails? Ask law enforcement. But when it comes to, you see these headlines with dealer arrested with enough fentanyl to, you know, cause an overdose of all of Cleveland, right? And there's a guy online by the name of Ryan. He's a journalist. Who his whole thing is going through those headlines and being like, this is not literally possible, right? I mean, the whole cops overdosing by fentanyl exposure, it boggles my mind how often I see that. I'm working with the same communities. I've never overdosed from fentanyl exposure.
Right.
These cops claim they pull a guy off the street. Next thing you know, you see a picture of them on the ground being administered Narcan. I'm literally sitting there with the same people. Like, what is happening in your brain? I don't understand it. So no, the journalists are not doing a good job on this topic on a broad spectrum. However, there are a couple outlets that I have to shout out because they are doing a good job. There's an outlet by the name of Filter Mag, and it's specifically on the topics of drug use and drug policy. And they hire people with lived experience. They hire people who are dedicated to actually getting real stories out there. On my show, I've interviewed the editor and a couple of the writers. I did a project with one of the writers. Really amazing people who actually know what is going on. So props to them. And also the other one, they don't get it right all the time, but Vice News a couple years ago publicly sort of did a mea culpa and said, we want to apologize. We have not done a good job on the topic of drug use and all of this. We are going to change. And since then, again, they're not getting it right all the time, and they've made some pretty boneheaded moves as well, but they have more times than not tried to get the story. And the way they're doing it, and they're very open about this, and I props to them for doing so, is they will not use law enforcement as sources. They actually want to talk to drug users. And so when I'm out there in the field here in Philadelphia, I can't tell you how many times I've actually been walking around with a Vice News person, right? Whether they're there with a camera or they're just a reporter with their notebook, who are actually talking to people like us who are doing the work, or drug users themselves trying to get the real story and not relying on law enforcement to be their to be their source. And quite frankly, is it more work for them? Probably, but they're gonna get a better story that way.
Because the reason I'd ask that, sometimes you hear these like positive stories, and again, I'm speaking from, I guess, the perspective of like being a veteran, where they'll be like, hey, there are these guys that they have severe levels of PTSD, and through
psilocybin therapy.
Well, there's that, and then there's like even just like utilizing marijuana, right? Like especially in places where like they're legally able to. But you hear about, well, like ayahuasca, right? Mm-hmm. You hear about these different things, and they're like, but it only pertains to like, you know, you are absolutely in the most traumatic worst case scenario. And then the other thing that like I feel we always see is, you know, celebrities, right? Like this very young uprising, you know, pop, rap, whatever, rock star OD'd on fentanyl or whatever it was. And sometimes, because it started to happen like more and more often, it just seemed kind of, it was hard for me to fathom, because I think the reality is there's probably a huge issue. There's plenty of people that OD every day, but like they would bring it up, and it was almost like they're just kind of like, you know, again, drugs are bad, don't do drugs, they're all the same, you know, whatever. And so that was kind of why I asked you the question is, you know, have you ever heard of Little Pete?
Yeah, so it's funny you say that. I was a giant fan of Juice WRLD.
Right.
That one hurt a lot. You know, and what was so sad is, yeah, I mean, Little Peep was recently, but like there was a time there was Extension, Juice WRLD, and one other dude were all within like 3 months of each other. The thing is, so 2 points here. The first of which is that when we talk about fentanyl, when we talk about people ODing on fentanyl, there's a really important word we're leaving out, and that word is illicit. 92 or 96% of the world's fentanyl is safely used in medicine. And if you went to your doctor next time you were getting a major surgery and you said, Doc, I do not want fentanyl, they'd be like, fine, go get surgery somewhere else, because they're not going to be able to do what they want to do for you, or you are going to be in such unbelievable pain, right? I remember, this is sort of an aside, but back in 2008, 2009, I was at a music festival. This is when I was at my worst, on my pills and all that. But there was a dude there with me who was higher than I've ever seen a human in my life, off of a fentanyl lollipop. I mean, fentanyl's been around forever, right? I mean, this had been diverted from a hospital. So fentanyl's been around for a long time. It wasn't an issue until a couple of years ago, and it became an issue because law enforcement was doing such a bang up job of cracking down on heroin that dealers couldn't get heroin, right? And fentanyl, the same amount of fentanyl to get a person high that you need for heroin, I mean, it's minuscule. And fentanyl, it doesn't have odor. You can smuggle it in much easier. The stat that blew my mind was all of the fentanyl seized in the last couple of years would fill 2 drums. I mean, this is nothing. We're talking about nothing. And the users don't really want this either. They want heroin. But heroin is gone because of law enforcement. And if you are struggling with addiction, you're going to take whatever you can get. So this leads to people who care about this saying a really important thing, which is that these drugs are not killing people. It is prohibition that is killing people. When you see other countries doing a better job than us, a lot of them have what is called either safe supply or government supply, right? And what that means is, we know you're going to use drugs. Would it be better in an ideal world? Sure. If nobody used drugs, of course, fine. There's a lot of things that would be better in an ideal world, but we know you're going to use. And so, there are places like Portugal is the most famous model, where all drugs were decriminalized. As long as you work with people, you're not going to go to jail for drugs. It takes a lot to end up in jail for drugs over there. And there are a lot of people who have maintenance heroin doses, where they'll come in, they'll get their dose once or twice a day. My favorite stories, and these are in Drug Use for Grown Up, is the guy who every day in his lunch break, he walks down to his neighborhood dispensary, sits down in a chair, gets his heroin, and goes right back to work, right? This is how this stuff can be used in a safe environment. But here in the US, we like to close our eyes and pretend that we can wish away drug use. And so people have to sneak around and get their drugs from back alley dealers, right? And so that is what is leading to this rise of overdoses. And if you want the one that boggles my mind, man, is when people say to me, but we have to make a statement. If we let people get away with drug use, we have to make a statement. It's like, what statement would you make that is not already being made when literally 100,000 of my friends are dying every single year, right? If you want to make a statement, it's right there on the front page. There is not a person who uses drugs that doesn't know someone who has OD'd, who doesn't know 10 people who has OD'd. That statement has been made 10 times over. So we get it. We get your statement. Now let's get past your statement and actually think about how to save people's lives.
Yeah. And it seems like the common theme we keep going back to is law enforcement and jail time, basically. Yeah. That's what happens to drug users. Instead of helping them through that or supporting them with a safe method, we throw them in jail a lot of the time. And even for things like cannabis, there's people sitting in our private jails, making panties or whatever for a penny an hour, and corporations profit off of that. So it's kind of an endless cycle. I did a senior paper on private prisons and how we kind of feed into that as a country of keeping the beds full. And this was a way to do it with low-level drug offenses. And then some people, if you get 3 strikes, you're out and you're in there for the rest of your life. And like you said, it's more of a thing that needs a safe option or just mental health support at the end of the day. Therapy, counseling, the support group, which our country also doesn't have. How do you guys kind of bridge that gap, kind of switching over to mental health? Do you do anything with support groups there? Anything that's kind of crowdfunded or sourced?
Most of the work that I'm doing is down the field from that. I think what is so startling is Megan, you make a really good point. And we've seen this recently on a whole host of topics where our country is super reactionary, right? We look at this thing is happening, let's do the first thing and then not worry about anything else, right? Gun violence, well, we gotta, I mean, everybody has their opinion, and then the smart people in the room are going, well, how about jobs? How about healthcare? How about mental health care? How about all of these things? Housing, right? I mean, if you want to help eliminate gun violence, let's have secure housing. So the same can be said about drug use. If you want to cut drug use, it's not about the drugs. A lot of us, I think I'm a good example of this. I used to use in a really unsafe way. Now I use in a safe way because my life is a lot more stable and healthy now. I can use cannabis. I've never had an issue with alcohol, but I don't want 10. They're adding positive things to my life, whereas 10, 12 years ago, they were filling a hole that needed to be filled. If that hole had been filled in a healthy way, then I don't need to turn to drug use to try to fill that hole. That's all most drug use is trying to find a way to fill a hole. We don't know what the full equation is that makes people struggle with addiction. Anyone who claims that we do is lying to you. We know a lot of the variables, but we don't know, is it this thing times 3 plus this thing times 4? Like, we don't know that. The variables we do know are things this country isn't interested in addressing, right? We don't really address mental health care. That's not a thing that we do. We don't do a good job of teaching kids when they're young self-regulation. And we had health class, but we didn't have mental health class, right? So leading to these things. And to your earlier point, when someone does stumble, instead of saying, hey, we get it, let's teach you how to do a better job next time, we throw them in prison, right? And there's so many people who went in over some BS charge and come out, their entire life is ruined. So, we need to do a better job upstream. When we talk about prevention, we should be talking about healthy lives. We should be talking about fulfilled lives and happy people, not things like dare and just say no.
That's I just call it the system at this point, because it's not even just, I think it's a global thing. Like there's a system in place that if you don't know the rules of the game, you can't play the game, right? And I think there's a lot of forces in place that would like to keep it that way, right? Like we're like prisons being a cage and not a rehabilitation, right? There are so many things that I feel like I'm still very early in my journey, which is funny because when I was a kid, I thought at age 30, it was like, I'm an old man, where's my walker, right? I'm 34, I feel younger than I ever have, and I'm more excited about life than I've ever been, right? And a part of that is, the self-discovery. I think a lot of things that happened to me made me think that I was supposed to figure out who I was through other people, other experiences, media, whatever it was. One thing as I try to understand myself is I've learned and understood, some of the importances of being able to alter your consciousness to allow you to see things that, maybe you could find it through meditation, right? I say it all the time, like, I really want to meditate. And they're like, oh, do you practice? And I'm like, once,
But you really want to.
Yeah.
well, and it's the thing, right? Like we say and we do things and like in our heads, we have like this version of ourselves or whatever, but then, if you follow what people spend their money on and what they're doing with their time, you really see what matters and what's important. And, that was like a tough look in the mirror for me, right? But whatever. So I think that there's so many things, and I like the fact of, instead of just having a quick reaction and then it's like, well, we reacted to it, we're done. It's let's actually deep dive into it and see where the importance of finding the solution is, right? If you're freaking out about gun violence, it's like, well, why are guns such a necessity for some areas and people? And it's all about opinions and everything, right? Like a lot of stuff can't, it's hard. A lot of emotion gets involved. And that's a conversation I think I would love to have with you, hopefully at another time. But one thing I did want to ask you, I'm not sure if I know how to ask the question, but I'm going to do my best. There are people in this world who, let's say they never did drugs or alcohol, right? And I'm going to say that in a way of like illegal substances, right? Actually, no, I'm going to rephrase that. So drugs and alcohol can lead to addiction. Great. But I would say that nicotine and caffeine are drugs. Would you guys agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Would you guys agree that sugar is a drug?
So, funny story. I included sugar when I did my TED talk because if you actually look at what the scientific data says, the top 3 most harmful substances in the country are nicotine, alcohol, and sugar.
Mm-hmm.
However, since then, I have been made aware by people smarter than me that there is a growing movement to rethink what we think we know about sugar. And so while I'm with you, man. I mean, as a guy in recovery, nothing has me hooked like sugar does. It's an actual problem for me. Like, I try to practice mindfulness as much as I can. I mean, I have a lot of habits built into my day. The number one mindfulness practice that I struggle with the most is mindful eating. And because when I have sugar, all bets are off. I will have wolfed that thing down before I've even tasted it, right?
Right.
So I'm with you. However, part of this journey is being willing to admit I don't always know what's best. And because I've had so many people share with me, there is this new way of thinking about sugar. I am now saying the jury's kind of out on that one because up until 6 months ago, I would have said the exact same thing you did. And now it's like, once you say that, then of course people come out of the woodwork going, I can't believe you said that. How are you not aware of all this going on? And then you feel like an idiot. So it's sort of like yes and no is going to be my answer to what you said.
Okay. And that's totally cool. And I respect and appreciate that. Like, there are probably things I need to look into, right? And I speak from a place of a lot of people, whenever we're struggling with health, alcohol and sugar usually cause us to have quite a bit of weight gain. Because like you said, with the sugar, I'm like, well, one more bite, right? Like I am a very regulated person when it comes to my diet. And it's regulated to the point of like, I love ice cream. That's my it's not a kryptonite. I have a love for ice cream, and I'm not going to keep that out of my life, but I'll sit down and I can eat a pint of ice cream like it's nobody's business. But I also, am paying attention to my calorie intake, and I'm being mindful of what I'm doing, right? I would never go tell someone to like go throw down on a pint of ice cream. Do you? But like, whatever, to each their own. The reason I brought that up was like, so there is addiction. And then you have this moment where you're like, hey, it's taken over my life and it's killing me. And so then you start working on it, and it's something that, if correct me if I'm wrong, but if you get to a point that you need help with addiction and you survive it, it's something that you have to work on for the rest of your life, right? You have to have that awareness of yourself and like how to maybe manage it. But if there are people who, let's say, they never do caffeine, they never do nicotine, they never do alcohol, they never do any of it, and they focus on sobriety, right? For some people, sobriety, I think, is the answer, right? And then for people who have experienced drugs, even if they didn't have like a crazy story of addiction and like almost losing their life, do you think that there are benefits to the individuals that commit to sobriety, even if they were like curious about? Because I mean, again, like, you can ingest caffeine in a safe way, nicotine. I mean, you've even explained that like people who can go on their lunch break, get their amount of heroin, and then go back to work, right? And like, so it's doable. But do you think there's benefits to the human experience of embracing sobriety?
So, sort of a very long answer to what you said. First off, for a lot of people, myself included, addiction doesn't have to be a lifelong thing. There's a lot of research. There was a guy named Stanton Peele who did a lot of research on what is commonly called of outgrowing addiction. And what he found was a pretty substantial amount of people, if they live through this hellscape that is drug use right now, do grow out of it at some point. Maybe you're like me and your life gets on a more stable path. I didn't. I had to go through a lot of treatment and shit like that. But
Mm.
people do outgrow this. It happens all the time. So, and for me personally, is the battle against addiction a lifelong thing? Yeah, because when you step back and you go, all right, it's not just drugs. You know, I know people who have an addiction to exercise,
Right.
and at one level we go, okay, that's a little weird, but like whatever, not a big deal. And then the next level, you're like, oh no, like that's a problem. You know, like the line between a friend of a friend who is such a CrossFit person that they are constantly injured, you know, I can look down on that and go, I think that's a problem. But other
Right.
people, oh, they're just working it, right? So that there's a line, very, very thin line between that and the person I know who hasn't had a job in 20 years and he's on public assistance because he works out 3 times a day because he has an addiction to exercise, right?
Right.
But the last time that I was in rehab, I didn't see the exercise addiction wing. That wasn't there, you know, because our society accepts that a little bit more, right?
Right.
And the big change over the last decade has been finally admitting that maybe there is some. I don't, you know, there's the jury's out on if sex addiction's a real thing, but there is an act of addiction in what is happening for a lot of those people, right? And going back to what you said before, it's kind of about control, where if you have control over this thing or if you don't, it doesn't really matter what it is. You know, if you like to eat a pint of ice cream and you're only doing it once every while, fine. You're doing that every day, we can all agree that's addiction. Like that is textbook addiction, right?
Right.
So it's less about the thing and it's more about the act. And that is what is changing. And when you flip that switch and you go, okay, it's not just the drugs, it's you know, whatever the subject of that loss of control is, then you start to see again, all right, what am I doing when I'm losing control here, right? You know, for me, through work with various therapists, I realized that when I was struggling with an emotion, I had been taught back in the day that the answer was drugs, and that led to my prescription pill addiction. But the line between that and now as an adult, me reaching for a candy bar isn't that thick. I mean, that is a very similar feeling. Now, is that a little bit safer than reaching for a handful of pills? Of course it is. But over time, it's not good for me, and I have the body to show it. So the fact that I'm trying to make here is that, you know, we need to stop looking just at drugs or at alcohol or at sugar, whatever the case is, and take a step back and see it as a mental health struggle that it is, right? We used to separate the two. If someone was struggling with mental health and addiction, which is ridiculous. Addiction is a mental health struggle. And whatever it means to you as a person, that's what we got to be focusing on.
And that was a great answer, because the reason why I use the word sobriety is, you know, you hear this thing of like, well, I'm sober, and it's like this task and it's a day in, day out. And being sober, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like
Yeah.
it's totally fine. But I love the fact that you brought up the point. You know, I've had to talk to people. Exercise is something for me that I was always good at. I like the endorphins, and like I needed to be stronger at one point in my life. And then now it's like something that, you know, but in my struggles of my mental health, I think during my 20s, I relied on processing stress and stuff through the physical aspect of it, right? Like, okay, at least I can work on this. I felt like I had control. And there is a difference between addiction to escaping your world by going to the gym and going to the gym with intention, right? Like it's all about that mindfulness,
1,000%.
the awareness. And so I 100% am grateful that you brought that up, because, you know, I have to be careful how I say this, because I obviously don't know everything, and I don't study it, but addiction is something that I think awareness can help you really battle addiction, like self-awareness and understanding where it's really stemming from. I mean, when I was a kid, I essentially I was like 5, but I was diagnosed with ADHD, and they put me on medication. And that medication definitely worked for everyone that tried to deal with me as a child, because it sedated me. It did focus me, but I was like sedated, right? And you know, it was crazy because when it would wear off, I mean, I was just sitting there, and then as soon as it went off, it was like I was released, and then all of it just came out anyway, right? I was never, and especially back then, there wasn't enough information, I think, right? Like, we've learned so much in the last 20 years about, you know, just the mind and the functionality. But my point is that I was a kid, and it was like, hey, like, there's an issue, here's drugs, right? And then I was given a new kind of drug because it was like, hey, let's, like, whatever. And then in high school, I was like, I'm out, I'm not doing this. Fast forward, and I start learning more about myself and my mind. I'm like, oh, like, wow, they were right, you know? And so there's nothing wrong with utilizing medication, drugs, right? There's a stigma that's attached to stuff. And all of that just leads back to, you know, food. People get addicted to sleeping and like the escaping mindset, you know? But one thing I was thinking about too was there are kids who have to get their, like, stomachs pumped, right? Because they drank too much alcohol. They found their parents' alcohol, or they go to college and they, you know, whatever. There is no war on alcohol. Like that's always kind of bothered me, right? And I'm not saying we need to get rid of it. There needs to be like basically what you were saying. Why aren't we realistically and honestly approaching these topics, right? And it's like, even now as I'm talking to you, I catch myself overthinking what I'm going to say because I don't want to offend people, right? Well, I don't have an addiction to, and it's like, I'm not here calling anyone out being like, you have this, you have that, right?
Well, I think we all have potential for an addiction. Even if you don't have one now, it doesn't mean at a later point you're going to be either chasing a feeling or you're going to be running from a feeling. And maybe
is there
that
such thing as a person without any addictions is my first question.
That's what, no.
So let me teach you all a new term. So we're trying not to say substance abuse anymore because it's a stigma-laden term, but also because it doesn't tell you that much. There's a term we're using instead that's less stigma and also gives you more information, and that is substance misuse. Because what are you doing? You're misusing the substance. When you say substance abuse, that term was created to try to make people who use substance out to sound like monsters, and it did a good job. But the substance isn't abusing you. It doesn't make any sense, right? When you think about abuse in other aspects, spousal abuse, all these horrible things, you know exactly what it means, and it means what it sounds like. Substance abuse doesn't mean that. The weed is not knocking me around the head, right? That's ridiculous. So substance misuse is exactly what you're talking about. And it's a very wide-ranging term. Everything from the most extreme forms of addiction that we've been taught are ubiquitous and in reality are actually quite rare. There was a study done not long ago that showed that even for the most extreme for if you look at all users altogether, roughly 4 to 8% of all drug users will ever struggle with addiction. It really is not that large. But a much more substantial amount of users will struggle with misuse. Mm-hmm. And that can be everything from that extreme addiction all the way to the kid who, as you just said, binge drinks on weekends. Does that kid meet the criteria for addiction? No. He's not getting the mental and physical withdrawals, which is a needed part to be described with as having addiction. He is not the diagnostic manual of mental health disorders has very specific criteria of what it takes to be diagnosed with an addiction issue. And someone who just binge drinks too much every couple of weekends will not fit that criteria. But you and I, we can all sit here and agree that doesn't mean it's not a problem, right? Mm-hmm. So that term helps people understand a little bit more that number one, there are ways to use a substance safely. And me having a drink tonight with over dinner with my wife is a healthy use of a substance, right? Mm-hmm. But if I was having 3 drinks every couple of nights, or if I was drinking and then driving, those are ways where I would be misusing that substance. So yes, to your point, that there are to an earlier point, there are changing ideas on this, but to your more recent one is these are things that we are not doing a good enough job of teaching as we're coming up, and as we are thinking about what does the next generation of healthy use of substances look like, especially now that we're legalizing cannabis, we're legalizing psilocybin, and if people like me have our way, we're going to see a lot of other substances follow suit. We want this to look more like cannabis and less like alcohol, because the alcohol rules all over the place. For perfect examples, where I live here in Philadelphia, you cannot get alcohol anywhere. I can't go to my corner store and buy a beer. I have to go to government run stores. But that doesn't mean that it keeps people from misusing it, and alcohol misuse is all over the place. However, we're not seeing a lot of cannabis misuse in the places where we have medical or it's been legalized, because it is very strict. And so I don't think that's the worst thing when it comes to some of these other substances. I would like to see that tried. I think there's a lot of unknowns right now. And I think if we did this interview again in 10 more years, cross our fingers, we're all still here on this earth and we haven't been wiped out. We'll have some really interesting things to talk about.
I mean, honestly, even a year from now, I'm sure it's going to be pretty different. I think it's interesting, and we're about to have to wrap it up, unfortunately, but we'll have to get you back on. The thing about it is, I love the fact that we, things get demonized, right? And stigma and all this stuff. And it's all at the end of the day about, we have to change the way we were taught to think. And I think that's because in a lot of cases, we're not taught to think like how to think. It's more about, this is what we want you to think, right? And so that's a whole nother topic in itself. I really want you to know that I hope you keep fighting the good fight. It's obvious that you have no intention of stopping anytime soon. And it's one of those things, like I'm one of those people. I like to joke around, like, I'm a meathead. I love to go to the gym, right? I love lifting weights. It creates a foundation for the rest of my life. Like, I can eat a pint of ice cream every once in a while, I think you brought up some great things, and I very much enjoyed it. I really hope that people saw the value in our conversation, and hopefully people are going to check out not only what you talked about today, but your socials and your website and all the things that you do, right? If we do meet again and it's in 10 years, I'm sure you'll have like 7 or 8 or 12 or 15 podcasts and like 18 organizations, right? It'll be awesome.
I hope not. That sounds exhausting. But,
you're like, that's a lot of work.
Hopefully we are farther down this field than we are today.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I just, like, now I have so many things I want to think about and like talk about, but we'll stop here. We do have to hit Megan's corner so we can talk about the fact that social media is real and it's a great way to get connected.
It sure does. Yeah. We are on all socials at Friends of Failure. We will link all of Jay's stuff as well, so you can easily find him and his organization. And then our email, if you want to send in your story, is friendsoffailurepodcast@gmail.com. Just send it our way. I think last time we asked no more nudes. We can't take any more. got Jay there. And yeah, we'll see what we get.
Yeah, I always like the idea of like talking to people and hearing their stories. I mean, even if it wasn't meant to be like shared as something on the podcast, right? Like just the connectivity of it. But, I just want to touch on what I said earlier of, if you're afraid of saying the wrong thing, or, it's like, well, what can I say? What can I say? I challenge people to try to just be honest with themselves and let their truth out. It's a hard thing to do for a lot of us, and baby steps is the way to do it. It doesn't have to be the biggest, craziest truth that you have. It could be something simple.
You can start small and you get to choose what you tell people.
Yeah. And we made a joke a while back of like, hey, tell us anything you want, except if you killed somebody, we don't want to know, or where you hid the body,
no
right?
Yeah.
We don't want to end up in court. No, but With all that being said, I hope everyone listening enjoyed today's conversation. I know I did, and I'm sure Megan as well. Thanks again, Jay, for coming out. And we'd like to leave everyone with this final thought. I try to live by it, as a mentality. But that phrase is, life is happening for you, not to you. So go out there and do something.
There you go.
If it's not I'm stronger than you, it's I'm wiser than you, I'm more loving than you, I'm more tolerant than you, I'm more sophisticated than you. It doesn't matter what it is, but this constant competition is going on. This is the secret. This is the secret. You can't make a mistake.